Okay, let's unpack this. Picture the map of the United States. Now, mentally erase most of the internal borders. Imagine, just for a moment, that the 48 contiguous states weren't individual states at all, but one giant singular entity. One massive megastate existing alongside Alaska and Hawaii within the U.S. federal system. Sound wild.
It absolutely is.
And that mind-bending hypothetical is exactly what we're diving into today.
Yeah, it's a concept that takes the very architecture of American federalism and, well, twists it in an extraordinary way. We've been looking at this through a specific analytical source, single U.S. state analysis.pdf.
Right.
And, this isn't some policy proposal. It's a rigorous thought exercise, really designed to unpack the staggering constitutional, political, legal, economic transformations, all of it, that this kind of consolidation would trigger.
And our mission for this deep dive is really to extract the most important insights from that analysis. What does this monumental hypothetical reveal about the mechanics of governance and society at scale? What would it truly mean for the U.S. as a nation and for you living in, what used to be your state?
Immediately, the sheer scale is the first thing that just hits you. Based on recent census data, the total U.S. population is around 348.1 million. Alaska and Hawaii combined, maybe 2.2 million.
Okay.
That leaves this potential consolidated state with approximately 397.9 million people.
So we're talking about a single state that is, in terms of population and landmass, essentially a nation operating within a federation of just 3 states.
Exactly. And the core challenge, as this analysis makes crystal clear, is how you reconcile that entity's status as a single state when it contains the population and diversity of, like, a continent.
Right.
The vast powers that the 10th Amendment reserves to the states, they'd now be concentrated in this one colossal entity.
And the whole laboratories of democracy idea.
Gone. That system of 48 different experiments is fundamentally supplanted. Any innovation, any adaptation would have to happen within the megastate itself. That's a very different dynamic.
It's a fascinating setup.
Yeah.
So how are we going to navigate this? We'll follow the path laid out in the analysis.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We'll tackle the, frankly, unbelievable task of merging 48 legal systems into one. Then, designing the entire government structure for this entity.
Huge job.
Next, the massive economic transformation. After that, the impacts on society and regional identities. And finally, the truly radical shift it would force upon the U.S. federal system itself.
We're your guides on this journey through a hypothetical that honestly reveals a surprising amount about our current reality.
Let's start with the foundation then, the legal system. The analysis describes merging 48 distinct legal systems as a Herculean task. It sounds like trying to blend dozens of different languages into one coherent whole.
It's navigating a complex labyrinth, as the analysis puts it. I mean, just take criminal law. The point where a theft becomes a felony, it's dramatically different. $750 in Florida, maybe.
Okay.
Versus $2,500 or more in Texas or Wisconsin. And those aren't just numbers. They reflect really different philosophies on crime, punishment.
Sentencing guidelines too, right? Drug law.
All over the map. You'd have to somehow reconcile deeply conflicting, tough on crime and reform-oriented approaches that exist side by side across the current states. Yeah.
And it's not just criminal law, civil law. You mentioned Louisiana earlier.
Right. Louisiana is unique with its civil law tradition, rooted in French and Spanish codes. Most other states use common law, built on judicial precedent. But even within those common law states, the sheer volume and, frankly, the occasional contradictions in case law are immense.
Contract law differences.
Absolutely. Fundamental things, like whether you need cause or consideration for a contract to be valid. It sounds technical, but it matters.
On commercial law, setting up businesses, licensing.
Adds layers of complexity. LLC formation rules vary. Professional licensing, doctors, barbers, engineers, all different state by state. Sales tax on services, that's a huge one. Some states tax software subscriptions, digital goods, others don't. What's taxable in, say, Arizona might be exempt in California.
Family law must be incredibly personal and varied too. Divorce, property, custody.
None of it is uniform. The grounds for divorce, how assets get split community property states versus equitable distribution, states the factors judges consider for child custody. It all differs. Merging that touches deeply personal aspects of life.
Environmental rules.
Right.
California often goes further than federal standards.
Exactly. States can set more stringent standards. California's auto emissions rules are the classic example. Unifying everything means making massive policy choices, balancing economic goals and environmental protection for essentially a whole continent in one bow.
Education law, too, that's mostly state-controlled now, right? Graduation requirements, teacher certs.
Yep. Imagine the political battles over trying to agree on a unified curriculum or how to ensure funding is equitable across such a vast and diverse entity. It's mind-boggling.
And healthcare regulations, another maze, I bet.
Absolutely. Scope of practice for nurse practitioners, state rules on health insurance beyond the ACA, how hospital mergers are reviewed, even data privacy. California has stricter patient data breach laws than the federal HIPAA standard in some ways. Unifying this impacts access, cost, quality, everything.
So the big insight here really is the loss of those 48 laboratories of democracy, all that experimentation. Poof.
Yeah, it vanishes. Innovation has to somehow happen within this single giant system.
Hmm.
And the analysis notes something interesting. The complexity of legal codes tends to grow with population size.
So this megastate's code would be astronomical.
Potentially. And that leads to risks. Do you simplify everything down to the lowest common denominator just to get agreement? That might
Yeah.
weaken standards.
Or the opposite.
Or you try to incorporate the best bits from everywhere, creating an extraordinarily complex code that's almost impossible to understand or apply consistently across diverse regions. The analysis kind of draws parallels to the messy process of synthesizing state laws even now.
So how would you even start to merge all this? What are the tools?
Well, the analysis explores methodologies. First, you'd need to draft an entirely new code, probably involving massive commissions, expert panels.
Drawing lessons from federal law?
Exactly. Thinking about logical structure titles, chapters, sections using consistent language, like when to use shall versus may. Basic building blocks, but on a huge scale.
And looking at what the states did do, comparative law.
Crucial. How did different states tackle the same problem? Why did they choose different paths? This involves describing the laws, identifying similarities and differences, and understanding the reasons behind those differences. You have to overcome different legal terms, too.
Model codes must play a role here, like the UCC.
Absolutely essential. The Uniform Commercial Code is already adopted in some form by all 50 states. It provides a baseline for business law. The Model Penal Code has heavily influenced state criminal laws. These offer starting points, frameworks.
But they're just models. States adapt them.
Right, often with significant variation, so it's not a simple cut-and-paste job.
And then there's all the judge-made common law precedent. How do you unify that?
That's a monumental task for the new megastate Supreme Court. Imagine sifting through decades, centuries sometimes, of rulings from 48 different state high courts, often conflicting.
They'd have to pick and choose.
Essentially, yes. Decide which prior rulings to adopt, which to modify, which to overrule entirely. Much like the U.S. Supreme Court manages its own precedents, or how federal appellate circuits handle conflicts between districts, but magnified enormously. The decisions of this new megastate Supreme Court would become the ultimate vertical precedent, superseding all those old state court rulings.
What about ongoing cases during the switch? Which law applies?
Good question. You'd need transition rules, choice of law principles. Courts would have to figure out which former state's law had the most significant relationship to the case, or analyze the competing interests. It's similar to sorting out legal conflicts between countries, but now it's all internal.
So what does the final legal system look like? What's the best guess?
The analysis suggests it would likely be a unique hybrid. It might have the comprehensive, organized structure you see in civil law codes.
Like Louisiana's?
Sort of, in spirit, but it would probably rely heavily on common law judicial interpretation for its development and day-to-day application. Think maybe of California, it has civil codes but operates largely within a common law environment. Now scale that idea up dramatically.
And crucially, this new megastate system has to be supreme within its borders, right?
Mm-hmm.
Overriding the old state laws.
Absolutely. The analysis draws an analogy to federal preemption. The megastate's constitution and its new code would need clear provisions stating they are the supreme law, preempting any conflicting former state laws. You might even need to flip the usual presumption, initially assume the new law governs unless specified otherwise, just to get the system established.
Okay, as if that wasn't enough.
Yeah.
You mentioned Louisiana. The analysis highlights it as a particularly tricky challenge.
Yes. The Louisiana conundrum. It really is unique.
Why? What makes it so different in this scenario?
Its private law system, things like contracts, property, torts, is fundamentally rooted in the civil law tradition, not common law like the other 47. It has a comprehensive civil code, heavily influenced by French and Spanish law. Its own state constitution has provisions that make simply adopting common law concepts difficult.
So different sources of law, different ways of thinking legally.
Precisely. In civil law, the code is the primary source. Judges apply its principles, often using deductive reasoning. In common law, judicial precedent is key. Judges interpret and make law through cases using more inductive reasoning. The terminology is different too. Concepts like cause versus consideration in contracts, or property rights like usufruct, it's a whole different framework.
And trying to mix oil and water hasn't always worked well there historically.
The scholarship cited points that out. Past attempts in Louisiana to import specific common law doctrines, like certain types of intentional torts or the concept of promissory estoppel, sometimes created inconsistencies or didn't fit smoothly within the underlying civil law structure.
They didn't even adopt all of the UCC.
Right. Louisiana notably hasn't adopted key parts like Article 2 on sales or Article 9 on secured transactions, largely because they were seen as clashing with fundamental principles of its civil code, especially around property and obligations. It's a challenge to the entire legal methodology and culture for lawyers and judges trained in that unique system.
Though some argue it's already becoming a bit of a hybrid.
There's that argument, yeah, that Louisiana law in practice is becoming more pragmatic, maybe more like a common law process, but using civil law terminology. Like the gumbo metaphor the analysis mentions civil law meet in a common law roux.
So how do you integrate Louisiana? What are the options?
The analysis lays out a few possibilities. One, full assimilation. Basically, Louisiana adopts the common law framework of the megastate. That offers maximum uniformity, but means a significant loss of unique legal heritage and culture.
Option 2.
Carve-outs or special status. Give Louisiana some internal legal autonomy, perhaps letting its civil code continue to govern certain areas within its former borders. This preserves identity but complicates the single structure goal and requires complex internal choice of law rules. Think of it like internal bijuralism, maybe like how Canada handles Quebec's civil law. Harmonization or synthesis. This is the most intellectually demanding. Trying to genuinely blend principles from both traditions, creating a richer, more nuanced code for the entire megastate. Louisiana's experience could actually be a bridge here. But forcing a rigid common law template onto Louisiana risks creating an incoherent mess. The megastate itself might need to become a kind of mixed jurisdiction internally.
Okay, one last legal point the analysis brings up is adapting transitional justice. It sounds serious.
It does, but here it's not about prosecuting past human rights abuses. It's about adapting the principles of transitional justice to manage the profound legal and political disruption of this merger. How do you ensure the whole process is seen as legitimate? How do you address the inevitable inequities?
What would that look like in practice?
Think about setting up something like legal harmonization and equity commissions. Their job wouldn't be assigning blame, but like a truth commission, examining the impacts of merging these laws. Who is unduly burdened when property rules change? What happens to people whose professional licenses are no longer valid? How does welfare eligibility shift? They'd identify hardships and recommend remedies, a kind of truth-seeking about the consequences.
And providing actual help, transitional relief.
Exactly. Not reparations in the usual sense, but targeted assistance for people or businesses who can show demonstrable undue hardship directly resulting from the unification. Maybe retraining funds, temporary financial aid, support for businesses needing to comply with totally new regulations. It's about proactively addressing the transitional pains.
Plus reforming institutions and acknowledging the past.
Yes. Making sure the new mega-state institutions, courts, agencies are built on principles of rule of law, accountability, transparency. And explicitly acknowledging the diverse legal heritages being merged, explaining the rationale for changes, trying to foster a renewed social contract through public engagement.
Why is this transitional aspect so important?
Because managing the process of unification is absolutely crucial for legitimacy and stability. If you just impose massive changes and ignore the disruption, the confusion, the sense that some people are losing out unfairly, you risk deep resentment, instability, maybe even resistance. Proactively addressing those transitional pains, as the analysis calls them, is essential for building acceptance and cohesion in this entirely new entity.
Okay, so forging the law is one gigantic task. How about actually building the government and administration for this continent-sized state with over 337 million people?
Yeah, Section 3 of the analysis tackles this. You'd need entirely new branches of government, designed from the ground up. The U.S. Constitution mandates a Republican form of government for states, so it would almost certainly mirror the familiar three-branch structure: executive, legislative, judicial.
For the executive branch, one single governor for everyone. That sounds like immense power.
It does. A single governor offers clear authority, decisive leadership, which might be needed, but the analysis points out the risk of concentrating so much power in one person for an entity this size.
So what's the alternative?
An executive council model is discussed, maybe inspired by systems like the Swiss Federal Council, where you have a committee, perhaps representing different regions, making executive decisions collectively. It could offer broader representation, check power, but might be slower, potentially leading to gridlock.
How do you balance statewide policy with regional needs?
That's the core executive challenge. You'd likely need very powerful regional executive offices, or perhaps significant devolution of administrative authority to internal regions, even if you have a single governor or council at the top.
And the legislature? One big assembly or two houses?
A bicameral legislature, two houses, like the U.S. Congress and most states, seems much more probable for the megastate. It provides more checks and balances, allows for different principles of representation in each house, and generally encourages more deliberation. Nebraska is the only unicameral state now.
How would representation work in those two houses?
One house, likely the lower house, would almost certainly be based on population districts like the U.S. House. But for the upper house, the analysis suggests you'd almost need some form of regional representation to ensure less populated or geographically distinct areas have a meaningful voice and aren't just swamped by the big population centers.
Like the German Bundesrat model, maybe, representing regional governments.
Something like that is definitely discussed as a way to balance population and geography. Proportional representation is also mentioned as an alternative for reflecting the ideological diversity more accurately, but it's not really part of the U.S. tradition at this scale.
And the judicial branch. Similar structure.
Likely a multi-tiered system, yes. Trial courts at the base, intermediate appellate courts, and then a single megastate Supreme Court at the top. The sheer scale means you'd need numerous trial court districts, probably organized regionally.
And the intermediate appellate courts. Also regional.
Probably. Analogous maybe to the U.S. Circuit Courts of Appeals, handling appeals from trial courts within specific large regions. The analysis highlights the huge challenge for that single megastate Supreme Court, managing a vast caseload while also trying to unify legal precedent across the entire territory. Specialized courts for things like tax, commercial disputes, or environmental cases would likely be needed too.
The analysis also talks about internal checks and balances, right? Not just between the branches.
Yes, and this is critical. It's about applying those Madisonian principles within the megastate. How do you ensure checks between the central megastate government and its internal regional structures?
So the design of those internal regions is key.
Absolutely. Maybe the regional upper house checks the population-based lower house. Maybe regional sub-executives have certain powers. Perhaps powerful regional appellate courts provide a check on the central judiciary. This idea of nested federalism or internal checks is vital to prevent the central government from becoming too dominant or remote.
Which leads right into the need for internal subnational governance. Why is this basically essential?
Because trying to govern over 337 million people spread across a continent from one single monolithic center is, well, it's unworkable, administratively impossible, politically untenable. You have to break it down somehow.
How do you draw those internal lines, though? Old state borders.
That's one option, offers continuity, people identify with those areas, but it might also perpetuate old rivalries or economic imbalances that maybe aren't logical anymore.
Or draw new lines.
The other option is to configure entirely new regions based on logical factors like geography, major economic zones, transportation networks, maybe even cultural affinities. Applying the principle of subsidiarity handling issues at the lowest effective level might argue for drawing new lines that make more sense for governance today.
And what kind of units would these be? Just administrative zones?
That's the simplest model. Regions are just arms of the central government implementing its policies, but the analysis suggests it's more likely you'd need regions with some degree of genuine autonomy.
Like elected councils with actual powers.
Potentially, yes. Elected regional councils with limited legislative or executive powers over specific areas, maybe local public services, land use planning, aspects of education or public safety, perhaps even limited local taxation authority. This starts to resemble devolution models we see in countries like the UK or Spain, possibly even asymmetric devolution, where different regions have slightly different powers.
The analysis mentions U.S. examples like councils of governments or international ones like German Länder or Canadian provinces.
Right, looking at existing models for how internal autonomy can function within a larger structure. The key is that the design of this nested federalism or devolution, how much power regions get, how they're structured, is absolutely critical. It's essential for administrative efficiency, keeping government responsive, preserving regional identities, and preventing the central government from becoming too remote or autocratic. It would be one of the most contentious design issues.
Okay, on top of structuring the government, there's the practical nightmare of administrative consolidation, merging all those state bureaucracies.
Colossal complexity is the phrase used. Think about public services first: welfare, child protection, public health, education. You're integrating 48 different delivery models, eligibility criteria, IT systems, regulations.
And ensuring equitable access.
That's paramount. How do you design systems that work effectively for incredibly diverse populations, urban centers, remote rural areas, immigrant communities, tribal nations within the territory? Ensuring culturally appropriate responsive services across the board is a massive hurdle.
Physical infrastructure, too. Roads, parks, state buildings.
Yep. Merging 48 state departments of transportation, park systems, public works agencies. That means standardizing maintenance protocols, integrating complex IT systems for things like traffic management or asset tracking, managing vast portfolios of land and buildings, creating unified capital plans for investment across the whole territory. Lessons from city mergers suggest it might be smarter to consolidate specific functions rather than just smashing entire agencies together blindly.
And the people.
Yeah.
Millions of state employees.
The scale is daunting. Merging 48 different pay scales, benefit packages, pension systems, union contracts, civil service rules. It's incredibly complex and politically sensitive. Then there's consolidating mountains of records, both paper and digital, ensuring data integrity, security, privacy, public access under new rules.
How do you even manage that workforce transition?
It requires massive workforce planning, probably significant retraining programs, and crucially, fair and transparent procedures for handling redundancies or job changes. Engaging directly and openly with employees and their unions would be absolutely vital to manage the human side of this consolidation.
The analysis specifically warns about an implementation dip here, doesn't it?
It does. During any large-scale merger or consolidation like this, service quality often temporarily declines, and costs frequently increase in the short term.
Why increase? Isn't consolidation supposed to save money?
Eventually, maybe. But initially, you have costs like harmonizing salaries and benefits, which usually means leveling up to the better package, massive IT investments to integrate systems, retraining costs, severance packages. If the focus is solely on cutting costs from day one, without a clear strategy for maintaining service effectiveness and supporting the workforce through the transition, the whole thing can fail. It can erode public trust and create a doom loop where poor management leads to declining services, which further undermines the mission. Prioritizing effective service delivery during the transition is key.
Let's shift gears to the economy. Creating a unified internal market of this size, over 330 million people. That sounds like it could unleash incredible economic power.
It's a profound transformation, no doubt, but getting there involves huge challenges, and crafting a singular tax system for this entity. The analysis calls that one of the most complex and politically charged aspects. Just look at the diversity we have now.
Yeah, income taxes are all over the place. 9 states with none at all. Flat rates, graduated rates.
Exactly. Top rates ranging from 2.5% in a couple of states up to over 13% in California, plus all the differences in deductions, exemptions, credits. Corporate income taxes are similar. Rates vary. Some states use gross receipts taxes instead or in addition.
Sales taxes, too. Different rates, but maybe more importantly, different bases, right?
Yeah.
What actually gets taxed?
Precisely, especially services. Is software as a service taxable? Legal services? Financial advice, it varies wildly. Combined state and local rates range hugely, too, and 5 states have no general sales tax at all.
Plus property taxes, severance taxes, estate taxes. It's a real patchwork.
So unifying this means making fundamental choices. What's the overall structure? Do you rely more on income taxes, consumption taxes like sales VAT or property taxes? How do you harmonize rates and bases across the board, especially for things like services that are inconsistently taxed now?
Predicting the impact must be incredibly difficult.
Very complex. Requires sophisticated economic modeling to estimate revenue effects. And then there's the distributional impact: who pays more, who pays less. People and businesses in formerly low-tax states would almost certainly see increases. Those in high-tax states might see decreases. This guarantees an intense political fight.
Driven by vested interests and different philosophies?
Absolutely. Different regions have vastly different fiscal capacities and needs, different political philosophies about the role of government and fairness in taxation. The analysis warns that the final tax system might end up being a messy compromise, full of special provisions and loopholes hammered out politically, potentially undermining some of the efficiency gains you'd hope for from unification.
Beyond taxes, there's consolidating all the public finances, debts, assets, and especially pensions.
An unprecedented amalgamation, as the source puts it. You're essentially merging the balance sheets of 48 state governments. The megastate would inherit a colossal portfolio of assets, land, buildings, infrastructure, financial reserves, but also an enormous burden of combined debt, both general obligation and revenue bonds.
How would financial markets view this new entity, its credit rating?
That's a big question. Credit rating agencies would have to assess this entirely new borrower. The 48 separate state municipal bond markets would effectively disappear, replaced by one giant megastate muni market. This could change liquidity, investor demand, and ultimately borrowing costs, maybe for better, maybe for worse.
And state pension funds. The analysis calls dealing with those most formidable. Why?
Because state public pension systems are incredibly diverse and, in many cases, deeply troubled. They differ hugely in how well funded they are, the actuarial assumptions they use, like expected investment returns or how long retirees will live, benefit structures, and investment strategies.
And many are underfunded.
Significantly underfunded in many cases, billions, sometimes trillions in aggregate, depending on how you measure it. Comparing liabilities accurately across states is already hard. Merging them all into one pot is a financial and political nightmare.
How could you even begin to consolidate them?
It would require massive financial restructuring. Options include large capital infusions. Where does that money come from? Issuing special bonds just to cover pension shortfalls, so-called pension obligation bonds, which are controversial, dedicating specific revenue streams, and almost inevitably making politically toxic adjustments to benefits or employee-employer contributions.
Plus standardizing everything.
You'd need new, unified governance structures for the combined pension assets. You'd have to harmonize actuarial assumptions, everyone using the same discount rate, for example. The impact on current and future retirees' benefits is a huge political flashpoint. There'd be pressure to level up benefits for those in less generous former state plans versus intense opposition to reducing benefits for those in more generous ones. It would require gradual, transparent, and likely very painful reforms.
And the analysis flags a moral hazard dilemma here. What's that?
It's the risk that former states that were less fiscally responsible, maybe made pension promises they couldn't really afford, might see consolidation as a bailout by taxpayers in states that were more prudent.
So the careful states end up footing the bill for the less careful ones.
That's the fear. It could create a disincentive for fiscal discipline in the future within the internal regions of the megastate. Why be responsible if you think the larger entity will just bail you out later? This highlights the need for a really robust internal fiscal framework for the megastate, clear rules, strong oversight, accountability for regional borrowing, and especially for how regional pension obligations are managed going forward. Preventing past moral hazards from resurfacing is crucial for long-term stability.
Okay, another huge economic shift. The change from interstate to intrastate commerce. How does that work?
Right now, the U.S. Constitution's Commerce Clause gives Congress the power to regulate commerce among the states, crossing state lines. So goods moving from, say, Michigan to Ohio, that's interstate commerce primarily regulated by the federal government.
But if Michigan and Ohio are now just regions within the same megastate,
that same movement becomes interstate commerce happening entirely within the borders of a single state. The primary authority to regulate that massive flow of goods and services shifts from the federal government to the mega state government.
wow. So the federal role shrinks dramatically in regulating the internal economy.
For most purely internal activity, yes. Federal commerce power would still apply to trade involving Alaska, Hawaii, foreign nations, or federally recognized Native American tribes, and arguably purely internal megastate activity could still substantially affect that remaining interstate or foreign commerce, giving the feds a hook. But the direct constitutional basis for federal regulation of commerce between the 48 former states changes fundamentally.
What are the consequences of that shift?
Potentially, you could see reduced internal barriers to trade if the megastate adopts uniform regulations for things like trucking, product standards, etc. That could lower compliance costs for businesses operating across the territory. Of course, the Uniform Commercial Code already helps harmonize some commercial law.
But you replace 48 regulators with one giant one.
Exactly. You get a single, potentially very powerful state-level regulatory apparatus governing most commercial activity within this vast area. Keep in mind, other federal laws based on other powers, environmental laws, labor laws, etc., would still apply, subject to preemption rules.
The analysis points out something interesting about the Dormant Commerce Clause. What happens to that?
The Dormant Commerce Clause is a federal doctrine created by courts that limits state laws that discriminate against or unduly burden interstate commerce, even when Congress hasn't acted.
So if there's no more interstate commerce between these 48,
That specific federal constraint largely disappears within the megastate's borders, but a new analogous problem arises internally. How do you prevent the internal regions of the megastate from enacting their own protectionist rules that burden commerce within the megastate?
so you need an internal Dormant Commerce Clause.
Precisely. The megastate's own constitution or foundational laws would need strong provisions to guarantee free trade within its borders and prevent its internal regions from erecting barriers against each other. Otherwise, you undermine the whole economic benefit of unification. You could end up with internal regional protectionism instead of state-level protectionism.
Finally, under economics, what about the impacts on where development happens, on labor markets, supply chains?
Big impacts expected there. Labor mobility is one. Right now, state-specific occupational licensing is a significant barrier preventing people, nurses, electricians, accountants, you name it, from easily moving to another state for a job.
So unification could fix that.
If the megastate implemented unified licensing standards or robust reciprocity agreements across its territory, it could create a truly national labor market within those 48 former states. That improves the economic efficiency, gets workers where they're needed, but it requires harmonizing often very different standards, which is politically tough.
What about regional economic disparities? Would they shrink or grow?
The analysis suggests existing disparities between prosperous coastal areas and struggling heartland regions, for example, would likely persist and could even be exacerbated initially. There would be immense political pressure on the megastate government to promote equitable development across its vast territory.
Could big infrastructure projects help bridge those gaps?
Maybe, but it's complex. Investing heavily to connect peripheral areas to core economic hubs could boost overall GDP growth. But economic geography tells us it might also accelerate the concentration of activity in those already dominant hubs, potentially widen the gap with lagging regions.
Supply chains inside the megastate would likely get simpler.
Probably more streamlined and efficient, yes. Fewer state borders acting as regulatory or tax friction points for logistics within the territory. Businesses could optimize routes and distribution networks more easily. Of course, these supply chains would still be deeply integrated into global ones.
And unemployment insurance, another system to merge.
A huge one. Consolidating 48 diverse state UI systems, different eligibility rules, benefit levels, durations, financing mechanisms, employer taxes. It's a major administrative and policy task. Potential benefits are reduced admin costs for multi-state employers and more consistent income support for laid-off workers. But the challenge is designing a single system that works for vastly different regional labor markets and costs of living. Is a uniform benefit level adequate in both New York City and rural Mississippi?
The analysis talks about unleashing forces of agglomeration and dispersion. What does that mean?
Okay, so when you reduce barriers and improve connectivity across a huge unified market like this, economic theory predicts two opposing forces get stronger. Agglomeration is the tendency for economic activity, talent, and investment to cluster in certain locations, usually existing major cities and economic hubs.
Why does that happen?
Network effects, deep labor pools, knowledge spillovers, economies of scale. Businesses benefit from being near other businesses, suppliers, and skilled workers. This concentration boosts overall GDP.
But dispersion is the downside.
It can be. While the hubs boom, other areas, the peripheries, can get left behind. They might see slower growth, brain drain, disinvestment, as resources and opportunities flow towards the agglomerating centers. So, the unified market could intensify this dynamic, boosting overall wealth but potentially worsening inequality between regions within the megastate.
So the policy challenges.
How do you harness the economic benefits of agglomeration while also promoting more balanced, inclusive growth across the entire territory? This likely requires deliberate policies, targeted investments in lagging regions, programs to diffuse innovation and skills, maybe forms of regional aid or fiscal equalization. Failure to manage this tension between concentration and dispersion could lead to serious internal political friction and undermine the cohesion of the megastate.
Okay, moving beyond the structures and the economy, what about the human side? The impact on identity, culture, and how over 337 million people feel represented in this behemoth.
Yeah, Section V gets into this. This is about the lived experience. And a primary concern raised is the potential for erosion or homogenization of those distinct regional identities, cultures, dialects, traditions, the whole rich tapestry that currently makes up the U.S.
How could you possibly preserve that diversity within one giant state?
The analysis stresses that mechanisms for preservation would be essential. It loops back to the idea of meaningful devolution and regional autonomy we discussed earlier.
Like in Spain or Canada.
Right, looking at examples where distinct regional or national identities persist within larger political structures. You'd likely need constitutional or strong legal protections for cultural heritage, possibly minority languages where they exist, even protecting traditional place names. Things like requiring cultural impact assessments for major policies, providing state support for regional cultural institutions and education, ensuring community engagement. It all becomes crucial.
But the analysis also suggests something counterintuitive, that this massive consolidation could paradoxically strengthen regional identities. How does that work?
It's a phenomenon sometimes observed after municipal mergers or large-scale reorganizations. People might react to the perceived threat of homogenization by asserting their former state identity or a new regional identity within the megastate even more strongly.
Pushing back against the center.
Exactly. Using regional identity as a source of solidarity and political mobilization against the perceived influence of the central megastate government or other dominant regions, this could actually create new political cleavages based strongly on regionalism, which again underscores why designing robust regional autonomy and fostering genuine respect for diversity from the outset is so critical to holding the whole thing together.
Political representation.
Yeah,
Representing 337 million people effectively seems almost impossible.
it's an immense challenge. How do you ensure representation is fair, effective, and feels legitimate to such a vast and diverse populace? The analysis touches on different models of what a representative is even supposed to do.
Like delegate versus trustee.
Right. Should they just be a delegate, strictly following the wishes of their constituents? Hard to even know those wishes for hundreds of thousands of people. Or a trustee, using their own judgment for the common good. Risks alienating specific groups. Or a politico, blending the two. Probably the most realistic.
The analysis mentions other dimensions of representation, too.
Yeah, drawing on political science concepts. Formalistic representation, are they duly elected, accountable? Descriptive representation, does the legislature look like the people it represents in terms of race, gender, class, geography? Symbolic representation, do people feel represented, that the government stands for them? And substantive representation, does the government actually produce policies that benefit the people?
Descriptive and symbolic seem really important at this scale.
They could become more critical. When districts are huge, direct contact is limited. So seeing people like you in power, descriptive, and feeling a connection to the symbols and actions of government, symbolic, might become crucial for citizens' sense of legitimacy and trust.
But the sheer scale is the core problem for representation, isn't it?
Absolutely. Let's take the House again. If the megastate gets, say, 430 seats, each representative covers almost 780,000 people. That's vastly larger than most current state legislative districts and bigger than many current U.S. congressional districts.
What does that do to the citizen representative link?
Studies on large-scale government amalgamations often show citizens feel more distant from their representatives, less politically efficacious, like their voice doesn't matter, and participation rates can decline. This distance problem is magnified enormously here. It also potentially makes it easier for well-organized, well-funded groups to capture policymakers' attention compared to ordinary citizens or local community concerns.
So how do you foster citizen engagement, social cohesion, and trust across this massive, diverse entity? It sounds incredibly difficult.
Very difficult. You risk loss of local identity, feeding into distrust of the central government. Reduce participation because people feel their actions are just a drop in an ocean. And the potential for existing social cleavages, urban versus rural, ethnic divisions, economic inequalities to be exacerbated, or even new ones to form if the unification process itself is perceived as unfair or disadvantages certain groups.
What strategies does the analysis suggest to counter this?
It emphasizes things like robust participatory governance, finding real ways to involve citizens, community organizations, stakeholders at all levels, not just the central one. Making sure public services are delivered equitably and are culturally responsive to diverse needs. Actively working to strengthen social capital supporting community initiatives, local associations. Transparency and constant communication are vital. And creating effective mechanisms for addressing regional grievances and mediating disputes between regions and the central government before they fester.
The analysis also suggests this could reshape political polarization in the U.S.
It's an interesting thought. It might dilute some of the state-by-state partisan battles we see now simply by eliminating those state arenas. But it could also consolidate polarization into much larger, potentially more powerful regional blocs within the megastate.
Like blue coasts versus a red heartland region, but as internal factions.
Essentially, yes, or other distinct regional political cultures asserting themselves. The risk is what the analysis calls internal partisan federalism. Powerful internal regions dominated by one party or ideology might start acting like quasi-states, challenging the central megastate government if they perceive it as being controlled by opposing interests or unresponsive to their needs.
Using their leverage like states challenge the federal government now.
Exactly. Using their economic weight, their large block of legislators, their control over regional administration. This internal regionalism, potentially supercharged by partisan divides, could become a major source of instability and gridlock within the megastate itself.
Which brings us to maybe the most profound impact of all. How this hypothetical megastate fits or maybe doesn't fit into the existing U.S. federal system. The analysis calls this a paradigm shift.
It's a fundamental reconfiguration. It changes the very meaning of federalism in the U.S. context.
And congressional representation is where it hits hardest, right? Let's start with the Senate.
Profound disequilibrium. That's the term used. It's almost an understatement. The U.S. Constitution grants 2 senators per state, period, regardless of population.
So the megastate, with almost 338 million people, gets 2 senators.
2 senators. Meanwhile, Alaska and Hawaii, with maybe 2.2 million people combined, they get 4 senators, 2 each.
The imbalance is just staggering.
Extreme. You have 2 senators representing orders of magnitude more people than the other 4 combined. The Senate's traditional role as a body giving disproportionate weight to smaller states is completely broken, or at least transformed into something unrecognizable.
Those 2 megastate senators would have huge influence, though, wouldn't they?
Immense informal influence, almost certainly, simply because of the sheer size and importance of the entity they represent. But they still only get 2 votes out of 100, or 104 in this scenario, assuming D.C. stays. And for the citizens living within the megastate, their individual representation in the Senate is diluted almost to 0 compared to citizens in Alaska or Hawaii.
The analysis uses that comparison. 40 million in the 22 smallest states get 44 senators now, while 40 million in California get 2.
Roughly 338 million people get 2 senators, while about 2.2 million people get 4 senators. The long-standing critique of the 2 senators per state rule gets amplified exponentially.
Okay, what about the House of Representatives? That's based on population.
Right. Apportionment for the fixed 435 seats is based on population. The megastate, containing something like 99% of the total U.S. population in this scenario,
Gets almost all the seats.
exactly. Using the current apportionment method, it would likely get somewhere around 430 to 432 seats. Alaska and Hawaii are constitutionally guaranteed at least 1 seat each, so they'd probably get 1, maybe 2, depending on the exact numbers.
So a near monopoly in the House for the megastate delegation.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The tiny delegations from Alaska and Hawaii would have minimal legislative influence against that massive unified bloc. And internally, the megastate faces the colossal political task of drawing hundreds of congressional districts across its territory. All the potential for gerrymandering and fights over representation we see in states now, but scaled up dramatically.
And the collective voice of people in, say, the former Mountain West or New England is now just part of this one giant delegation.
Yes. The distinct regional voices previously channeled through separate state delegations get subsumed into this single massive one. While one person, one vote is maintained within the megastates districts, the power dynamic at the national level between the megastate and the other two states is fundamentally skewed in the House, too.
Which leads directly to the Electoral College. How does that change presidential elections?
It creates an entirely new center of gravity. Electoral votes equal senators plus representatives. So the megastate would have its 2 senators plus its 432 representatives, giving it somewhere around 432, 434 electoral votes.
And Alaska and Hawaii.
They'd likely have 2 senators plus 1 representative each, so 3 electoral votes each. The total number of electoral votes remains 538.
But you need 270 to win. The megastate alone has far more than that.
Correct. If the megastate allocates its electoral votes on a winner-take-all basis, as most states do now, the candidate who wins the popular vote within the megastate is almost guaranteed to win the presidency, period.
So presidential campaigns become entirely about winning the megastate.
Almost exclusively. National strategy boils down to appealing to the voters within that single entity. Swing states disappear, replaced by swing regions or swing demographics inside the megastate. The internal politics of the megastate effectively dictate the national outcome.
What of the small state advantage from the +2 Senate elector?
It's completely dwarfed and actually inverted. While voters in Alaska and Hawaii technically have slightly more per capita weight due to those 2 extra electors relative to their small population, the megastate's sheer number of electors gives it overwhelming power. Any power index measuring voter influence would show power concentrated almost entirely within the megastate.
The only scenario where Alaska and Hawaii have leverage is if no one gets 270 and it goes to the House.
Right, the contingent election. The House chooses the president, but each state delegation gets 1 vote. In that case, the megastate's huge delegation, hundreds of reps, gets just 1 vote, the same as Alaska's single rep and Hawaii's single rep. That's the one constitutional mechanism where the small states retain disproportionate power, though needing it becomes much less likely if the megastate is winner-take-all.
So pulling this together, how does this fundamentally reshape the balance of power between the federal government and the states?
It alters it completely. First, the powers traditionally reserved to the states under the 10th Amendment are now concentrated in one single, extraordinarily powerful subfederal entity.
Giving it huge negotiating power.
Immense leverage. In shaping federal policy, negotiating legislation, dealing with federal agencies, influencing fiscal decisions. The megastate speaks with the combined weight of nearly 340 million people, most of the national economy, and a near monopoly in the House. Federal agencies would need constant, extensive consultation with this one entity.
Cooperative federalism basically becomes a bilateral negotiation. Federal government and megastate.
Largely, yes. It shifts from a complex web of interactions between the feds and 50 diverse states to primarily a negotiation between the federal government and one dominant state entity. The analysis introduces this political science concept of the dominant member state problem.
Like Prussia and Germany or Russia and the USSR.
Exactly. History suggests that when one constituent unit in a federation becomes overwhelmingly larger and more powerful than the others, it can distort and undermine the federal balance. The megastate utterly dwarfs Alaska and Hawaii, potentially marginalizing their interests in national policy.
Could the federal government struggle to even assert its authority over the megastate?
That's a real possibility raised. Imagine the practical difficulty of the federal government trying to impose an unpopular mandate or preempt a law enacted by a state representing nearly the entire population and economy. It could lead to significant tension, maybe even standoffs. The megastate might centralize its own internal power to present a unified front, or it might demand greater autonomy from federal control, leveraging its critical importance.
What about fiscal federalism? Federal grants.
The distribution shifts dramatically. Formulas based on population, poverty, etc. would mean the megastate receives the vast majority of federal grant funding. The political dynamics around allocating discretionary grants would likely become primarily about negotiations between the president, federal agencies, and the leadership of the megastate, potentially sidelining the concerns of Alaska and Hawaii.
And federal mandates are preemption. More tension.
The main point of friction in the federal system becomes the relationship between Washington, D.C. and the capital of the megastate. The megastate would be in a formidable position to negotiate the terms of federal mandates, resist federal preemption it dislikes, and demand waivers or flexibility, simply using its immense scale and leverage. The The supremacy clause still exists constitutionally, but the practical politics of enforcing it against such an entity would be incredibly challenging.
So this hypothetical entity doesn't just change federalism.
Mm-mm.
The analysis concludes it strains the existing U.S. constitutional framework almost to the breaking point.
It really does. The traditional understanding of federalism, checks and balances, representation, it's all fundamentally challenged. The idea that states' interests are protected through their representation in Congress, especially the Senate, is severely strained by the massive representational imbalance.
Could lead to gridlock, or just the megastate calling the shots.
Both are possible outcomes discussed. Either paralysis at the federal level due to conflict, or a de facto shift in sovereign power where significant federal action becomes practically contingent on the megastate's consent or acquiescence. The analysis notes how political brinkmanship can erode governance. Conflict with a megastate could amplify that hugely. Or the federal government might just focus inward almost entirely on dealing with the megastate, further marginalizing Alaska and Hawaii. The very concept of states' rights is transformed, concentrated in one entity.
Wow. We've covered a truly monumental hypothetical transformation here, from unifying 48 legal systems and designing government for a continent-sized population,
To the massive economic shifts, the consolidation of finances, the impacts on regional identity and culture, the immense challenges of representation and cohesion.
and ending with this radical reconfiguration of the entire U.S. federal system, the challenges seem almost insurmountable.
They are immense. Integrating laws, managing complexity, navigating politics, tackling fiscal hurdles like pensions, preserving identity, ensuring representation, avoiding internal conflict, balancing power with the feds. It's staggering.
But the analysis did touch on theoretical possibilities too. Streamlined commerce, maybe better labor mobility, new ways of governing at scale.
Yes, it's a thought experiment that pushes boundaries. The analysis calls this entity the colossus within. It's not just a bigger state. It's portrayed as a potentially new kind of political entity for the U.S. It forces us to grapple with fundamental questions in new ways. Unity versus diversity, central power versus local control, individual rights versus collective might.
So, thinking about this analysis, this hypothetical that strains the Constitution and creates huge internal challenges, what does it ultimately reveal about the strengths and weaknesses of our current federal system, the one we actually have?
Or maybe, stepping back even further, what does exploring this extreme scenario tell us about the inherent trade-offs of scale itself, whether we're talking about a company, a city, or indeed a nation? What happens when things get really big?
Definitely something to ponder. A fascinating, if slightly terrifying, thought experiment.
Indeed. Something to consider as you look at that familiar map of the United States, maybe now with slightly different eyes.